Hello and welcome. I am seeing most of the participants trickling in on my little screen here, so I'm going to go ahead and get the program started. I am Professor Lisa Schultz at the University of St. Thomas School of Law in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I'd like to welcome you all today on behalf of the Terrence J. Murphy Institute for Catholic Thought Law and Public Policy. The Murphy Institute is a joint venture of the School of Law and the Center for Catholic Studies at the University of St. Thomas. Today's program is part of our Hot Topics Cool Talk series, in which we explore urgent and sometimes controversial public policy issues through conversations that offer more than one lens. Today's topic is hot. What is the impact of decisions being made every day by healthcare workers on the front lines of the coronavirus pandemic? What's the impact, especially on persons with disabilities, including the significant percentage of such persons who live in congregate care facilities and nursing homes? The two lenses from which we'll be examining this question are those of a theology professor who is an ethicist, Charlie Camosy from the Fordham University in the Bronx, and a lawyer who is an advocate for people with disabilities, Bud Rosenfield, supervising attorney with the Minnesota Disability Law Center and Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid. I'm not going to spend any more precious time with introductions. You have their information on the flyer and on the website. I want to get right to the program. Charlie and Bud are going to tag team through about 25 minutes of prepared remarks, and then we'll be taking questions from the audience. A lot of you are used to Zoom now, and you'll notice that we have disabled the chat function, so don't use the chat function for your questions. But once we enter into the question and answer period, please, what we'll be doing is taking questions that are in the question and answer feature that's down in the bottom of your screens. Feel free to start sending your questions at any time. I will be moderating and I'll be posing the questions. With that, let me turn it over first to Charlie to get our conversation started.
Thanks, Lisa. As a displaced Wisconsin boy, now in New York and New Jersey, it's great to be with a largely upper Midwest group, I have to say. I'm looking forward most to question and answer. I was asked at this first 5 minutes or so to give a quick and broad national overview, focusing on the ethical implications of policies for allocating scarce medical resources during the pandemic, with a particular focus on elderly persons with disabilities. And once it became clear that this was going to be an issue, I have to say two kinds of background or framing worries came into my mind. The first background worry came mostly from the fact that I had just wrote a book titled Resisting Throwaway Culture. And so I had in the back of my mind the phrase from Pope Francis, throwaway culture, which he's used quite a bit. And it was already strong, of course, during the pandemic. Before the pandemic, there was already a very strong throwaway culture. In my book, I write about how it focuses on abortion, euthanasia, hookup culture, mass incarceration, and more. But especially in our current context, I was worried with respect to the disabled and elderly in particular. So my second background, that's number one. My second background assumption and worry came from my experience as a bioethicist, especially in secular and clinical contexts. Science-minded people often struggle with ethics because there tends not to be easy answers to arrive that you can solve using a systemic methodology. The closest system that comes to this is in fact utilitarianism, ethical system. And that's one reason I think at least it tends to dominate in these circles. Indeed, in many contexts, it's just the default way people in clinical situations think about ethics. One highly rated medical school and medical center, in fact, who's been doing pandemic ethics webinars and classes have just only had utilitarians on their syllabus of ethicists to read. One way to do this, quote unquote, is to, in a utilitarian sense, is to get what's called QALYs, quality adjusted life years, or QALYs, I guess. If this sounds like it might be ableism, if you're going to quality adjust life years for every particular intervention that you think might be done, that's because it is. If it sounds like ageism because you think, well, if it adds 10 years, it might be good. If it adds only 6 months, it might not be. That's because it is. In my own work, in my own research, I've discovered, and maybe you know, that doctors in particular are notoriously bad at rating the quality of life of their patients and regularly rank them lower than the patients do themselves. Well, those are background assumptions. What did we actually see? Well, in the official places where we saw lots of ethical guidance, happily we did not see a lot of explicitly ableist claims like in the New England Journal of Medicine. However, we did see a lot of what I would call ageist claims with regard to life years added. And I helped write a document explaining why that was problematic, which was up at the Public Discourse website, which I think is going to be distributed to you later. The states, though, the state's policies were quite different. On March 23rd, for instance, a disability rights group in Washington State filed a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights at HHS saying that their policy for rationing ICU beds and ventilators was in fact discriminatory. 5 days later, on March 28th, the Office of Civil Rights at HHS releases guidance saying basically, hey, everyone's civil rights are still a thing. We got to have them. A week and a half later, on April 8th, the Department of Health for the state of Alabama releases an email saying, you know what, it probably wasn't a good idea for us to say, let me get the exact quote here, that, quote, profound mental retardation and, quote, moderate to severe dementia, end quote, would be taken into consideration when they're rationing their healthcare resources. A week and a half, and the OCR at HHS came to an agreement with them actually about that. And a week and a half later, California, also under pressure from disability rights groups, changed their ageist and ableist standards for distributing scarce healthcare resources as well. So I think, and my time is about to run out here, I think, we need to acknowledge that there were some good things done publicly. There were strong attempts from the states to have ableist and ageist policies in place, but I think it's important to note that that the public pressure that was put on from lots of different disability rights groups and from the Office of Civil Rights at HHS really helped make sure that we didn't get to a place that was bad, at least officially. I'll finish with this point. I think it's fair to say that the protocols, these state protocols, don't have the force of law. Bud can say more about that. But I think it's also important to say that we don't exactly know what's going on in each individual hospital or even with each medical team. So we may have to wait till the books are written or the long form articles are written to see what actually happened.
Thanks, Charlie. I think it's my task now to transition from that basic background, broad policy and ethical background information that Charlie just laid out for you to framing up or a more specific look at the legal landscape that a lot of the rationing policies and critiques are working within. So advocates in my position really look to three basic federal laws to determine whether a rationing policy or a crisis standard of care guidance complies with anti-discrimination statutes, and specifically the anti-discrimination provisions that protect people with disabilities. And those three laws are the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Section 504 of the Rehab Act, and Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare. And each one of those has similar language. The ADA has two titles that come into play in this discussion. Title II prohibits disability-based discrimination by state and local governments. So a lot of these policies that advocates have been attacking that Charlie alluded to are guidances that are put out with varying degrees of enforceability by state health agencies typically. And then Title III, which has similar anti-discrimination provisions with regard to private entities, including private hospitals, healthcare providers. Section 504 similarly prohibits and predates the ADA, prohibits disability-based discrimination by both federal executive branch agencies. We're not really talking about them in this discussion right now, but also by recipients of federal funding. So if you receive federal funds, if your patients are getting care paid for by Medicaid or Medicare, you're going to be covered by Section 504. Section 1557 filled in some additional gaps. They also prohibit, that provision also prohibits disability-based discrimination for healthcare programs that receive federal financial assistance or that are operated under federal programs or activities. So the healthcare exchanges or the basic health programs like Minnesota Care would be covered by the Affordable Care Act's anti-discrimination provisions. All of these try to cover essentially the waterfront, fill in the gaps, make sure that each entity is covered in some respect, and there's an overlap among the federal laws. But those are the main tools that advocates are using to critique and ultimately challenge state rationing and crisis standards of care policies and practices. There are also various state laws that come into play. In Minnesota, we have the Human Rights Act, which also has very good anti-discrimination provisions with respect to public services and public accommodations. It actually has more detailed language that it tends to mimic or be pulled out of federal regulations. That's not in the ADA itself, but is in the underlying regulations. So those are other tools that along with licensing provisions, that advocates might point to as a way of challenging existing policies and encouraging reform and better practices and policies. Charlie already referred to some of the recent activity that's gone on. This has, given the current pandemic that we're in, it's obviously captured the attention of a lot of policymakers and advocates. And at last count, I think that there were about a dozen states in which advocates had filed administrative complaints with the agency that Charlie referred to. Department of Health and Human Services has an Office of Civil Rights. They're charged with enforcing Section 504 and the Affordable Care Act, and they have an administrative complaint process. And in Alabama, Washington, Kansas, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, Utah, New York, Oklahoma, Connecticut, North Carolina, and Oregon. There may be a couple of others. I think that maybe California, a couple of others, maybe Texas. But in all those states, there have been administrative complaints filed. Most of them are still pending. A few of them have been resolved. The Alabama example that Charlie gave was resolved relatively quickly because it was one of the better examples of explicit discrimination embedded in their actual policies. They prohibited people from getting access to ventilators if they had any one of a handful of different kinds of conditions. Intellectual disabilities, severe mental retardation, not the most progressive term. We don't actually use that term anymore. That gives you maybe a sense of how up to date Alabama's thinking was on these policies and practices. People with severe traumatic brain injury, people with moderate to severe dementia, all of those individuals were covered and excluded from access to ventilation under Alabama's policy. And as Charlie said, OCR got Alabama to pull that and replace it with broad non-discrimination principles and a new ventilator policy that doesn't really quite say what the criteria are, but at least it doesn't allow abjectly discriminatory criteria to be used. The types of complaints have really varied. Other states have had less explicit language. In the Washington case, they talk about denying access or transferring people to palliative or outpatient care if they have a condition that manifests itself with a loss of reserve or energy, physical ability, cognition, or general health. That covers just about every disability group and a lot of people who wouldn't even fall under a disability category. It was pretty broad in its exclusion. And if you're thinking of this from an ethical and fairness standpoint, it's right to ask the question, why is that a fair, qualitatively effective kind of screening tool to use? How does that ensure fair access to healthcare, especially in any environment, but especially in an environment where we have scarce resources? And that's one of the questions that people are raising and challenging during this time. A little update on the OCR activity, or a little more detail. The bulletin that Charlie referred to actually covered a handful of different things. It covered HIPAA rights, it covered communication assistance in facilities, but it did make three main points specific to rationing that is informative, and it will be used by advocates and policymakers to critique and evaluate the legality of their current policies. The first was that it reminded people that the federal civil rights laws that we're talking about are still in effect. They haven't been waived. As part of the declaration of a national emergency or state level emergencies, some laws and some programs and policies do get suspended or waived. They have not been, so the facilities still need to follow them. The second is that while they recognize that providing quality and efficient healthcare is necessary, it's a laudable goal, it also has to be balanced with principles of fairness and equality, the same principles that underlie our federal civil rights laws. And the third specific point that it makes is that people with disabilities should not be denied care based on stereotypes, assessments of quality of life, the quality types of considerations that Charlie was referencing, or judgments, subjective judgments about a person's relative worth. Those are all impermissible. They shouldn't be used as a way of considering a person's disability and thereby excluding them from care. That's a very broad overview of the legal framework for these discussions. I think we want to transition now to talk a little bit about where Minnesota is in this whole discussion. And in 2009, the Institute of Medicine, part of the National Academy of Sciences, issued a kind of a guidance, a booklet, suggestion to states and localities that they consider crisis planning, that they develop crisis standards of care and ethical frameworks to apply should we be in a pandemic. And they did that on the heels of the H1N1 pandemic. Minnesota was already at work on this issue. In 2007, the Department of Health and the University of Minnesota formed a group that they called the Minnesota Pandemic Ethics Project. And that group, over the course of 2 or 3 years, ended up developing a few different guidance materials, relatively prolific. They came out with an ethics framework that was about 180 pages long. They came out with an implementation plan that looks at, how do you avoid having to ration care? How do you set up your systems to anticipate the need? How do you conserve resources in the middle of a crisis or a pandemic? And then ultimately, how would you ration them if you get to the point where demand outstrips supply of whatever it is we're talking about? Drugs, antivirals, vaccines, oxygenation, personal protective equipment, access to mechanical ventilation, whatever the treatment or equipment or medication might be. How do you ration that when you get to that point? Minnesota came up with fairly good guidelines. They specifically rejected a first come, first served basis. They said you can't ration based on categories like race, gender, religion, citizenship, because those things have no connection to the likelihood that you would benefit from the medical intervention. They also rejected those subjective quality of life or social value judgments, but they did not explicitly exclude the ability to ration based on either age or disability, which was instructive. And you can see how that ended up having a ripple effect throughout the policies. In many respects, where you get down to making those rationing decisions, it's based on prognosis. What do we think your likelihood of benefiting from this treatment is? And if you have underlying conditions or disabilities, how do they impact your likelihood of successfully completing the treatment or surviving, short and long term? And it's that survivability factor. When we start looking at whether you have an underlying condition that might limit your life, that might be, from a prognostication standpoint, poor. Will they use that against you in determining your access to care or in reallocating care, ventilation, for example, from you to somebody else who doesn't have those underlying conditions? That's a fundamental problem. You fast forward to 2019, 2020, Minnesota created these triage cards, patient care strategies, resource references and cards to be used. And there are 1 or 2 pages of what to do in a crisis with regard to oxygenation or antivirals or the use of mechanical ventilation. And throughout those cards and those guidance documents, these same concerns pop up. How are they looking at and evaluating your disability or underlying health condition and conflating that with your ability to benefit from the current COVID-19 treatment? And to the extent that they allow doctors or care teams to consider those, at a minimum, that's likely to have a disparate impact on people with disabilities over a population and over time. And so that raises concerns for us. We'll get into a little bit more what we've done about that. We have had discussions. We did not file an OCR complaint. I say we. I work for the Disability Law Center, nonprofit legal aid organization. We represent people with disabilities. But we did reach out to the Departments of Human Rights and Health, and we've had ongoing discussions with them. And they have begun to change their policies, and they've come up with some improvements that we'll talk about. But I think right now I'm getting the sign that says I'm supposed to shift it back to Charlie. So let's turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Bud. So I was asked to give a critique of Minnesota, Minnesota's policies, some of the stuff Bud just talked about, and I will in a moment. But as somebody who teaches and works in New York, I wanted to begin there. And I wanted to focus on nursing homes in particular, because I think that's related. And I'll make the case for that over the next 3.5 minutes or so. But as you may know, if you follow the national news, for many weeks now, we've been puzzling over why Governor Cuomo and his administration insisted that COVID positive patients be forced into nursing homes. After all, we've known since the beginning of the pandemic, actually, that nursing homes would be a center of the pandemic. The first main outbreak we had was in a nursing home in Washington State. And I was on Tucker Carlson's show on Fox News recently, and he asked me why I thought that Cuomo's administration did this. And I said I didn't know, but an educated guess was that they were afraid of overrunning their hospital beds, and they wanted to maximize their bed space, ICU bed space. Hospitals have not been forthcoming, and media have been strangely compliant in investigating them, actually, throughout this whole process. I've been frustrated time after time that we haven't got stories that we need to be getting about what actually went down. I have some colleagues who've worked in New York hospitals, friends even, who said that we did in fact overrun our capacity in some ways. And even a friend of mine suggested to me personally that that's probably why the patients were sent to nursing homes, because they were afraid of overrunning capacity. There were other hospitals, and even, as you probably saw, boats, vessels on the water that could have taken patients, but there's the issue of how you do that, and the logistics of that are complicated. But anyway, when we were ramping up, all of the PPE, all of the extra staff, all of the training went to critical care facilities. Nursing homes got nothing, despite the fact that we knew that they would be a center of the pandemic. We didn't give them anything. We did give them COVID positive patients, and even in northern New York, apparently some COVID positive nurses were sent to work in nursing homes, which is just unbelievable. And to be fair to Cuomo, this wasn't just in New York. Similar policies were in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, California. California, in fact, is still trying to pay these long-term care facilities to take COVID positive patients. Minnesota is one of the states, Michigan, but we haven't really gotten a strong sense, I haven't at least got a strong sense that there have been any quotes from anybody on the record saying, yes, the reason why we did this was because of rationing beds in critical care facilities. But I saw in preparation for this, the Star Tribune had a article covering nursing homes, the nursing home debacle in Minnesota. This was on the 20th. And it noted, among other things, that 81% of deaths in Minnesota have come from nursing home residents, and that you're still taking COVID positive patients in Minnesota. But here's a quote that really stuck out to me that's relevant to what we're talking about here. It was the Minnesota Department of Health who finally said, for the first time ever, as far as I can tell, I pay very close attention to these things. They said, quote, hospital beds are a key resource during this pandemic. They must be preserved for those who are in need of acute care, end quote. So that seems to be a direct quote saying, hey, the reason why we set a wildfire of infection and death in nursing homes is because we wanted to keep critical care beds open for others. And if so, then that was a massive rationing. That was a massive example of rationing, an example of this is a throwaway population, it seems to me, that we just simply didn't care about. And if we talk about not just older persons, but disabled persons, according to the CDC, 50% of nursing home residents have some kind of dementia. So I'm not a lawyer. I'm curious what Bud thinks about this, but I know that there are civil rights violations if a particular policy can be shown to have what's called a, quote, disparate impact on protected classes of people. Presumably this would include the elderly and disabled population. The Washington Post reports that our best guesses are that about 50% of all those who died of COVID-19 were in fact residents of nursing homes and long-term care facilities. That's across the country. And that's overall. Recently, it's become even more. For instance, Connecticut recently reported that 90% of their deaths from COVID-19 were this kind of population. So I don't know what counts as disparate impact legally, but if this does not count as disparate impact on our elderly and disabled populations, I don't know, frankly, what does. But hopefully Bud has something to say about this, including some other things, and maybe we could talk about that in question and answer. And I think my time is up.
Thanks, Charlie. I'll answer your question. Yes, it counts as disparate impact. It's a problem. What we don't know, if you go on the Department of Health's website, there's a wide array of data that you can see to follow where what by county where COVID-19 has hit hardest, how many positive cases we have by facility, how many deaths we have in various facilities, and they divide that up in lots of different ways. What we don't know in the context that you just described, the numbers that you described, is the percentage of people who are already living in the nursing facilities go to the hospital for acute care and then return to their nursing facilities. Because on the one hand, you would say they're entitled to return to the nursing facility, and the nursing facility needs to take them back and provide proper care to them. That's one group of people, and we don't know. We know that dynamic is happening. What we don't know is how many people are not in a nursing facility, go to the hospital because they're experiencing COVID-19 symptoms, get treated for that, and then for whatever reason ends up being transferred to a nursing facility for ongoing care or because of other issues relating to not being able to go home. And that becomes a bigger problem and part of the larger issue that you're talking about, because to the extent that we are funneling those individuals into congregate care settings, not supporting those congregate care settings with proper PPE and other health resources, and not looking for ways to support them back in community-based settings, it creates a whole host of problems. One of which is the rationing sort of channel that you just described, and the disparate impact that is going to have on people who are older and people who have disabilities. Other issues that it raises are issues related to, under the ADA would be what advocates refer to as Olmstead violations, where you're unnecessarily institutionalizing people to provide them services and supports rather than giving them those services and supports in the community. That's a problem. We certainly have programs under our medical assistance program that could be used to serve these individuals. The question is, why not? Why aren't they being used? And so for us to attack that issue, we need more information. Like a lot of things, we need more information. In the rationing discussion more broadly, we're still in the information gathering phase. We don't know. We've been talking mostly about policies that are created at the state level and then are issued as guidances to healthcare systems, whether in Minnesota or whichever state we're talking about. In most cases, those guidances are exactly that. They're not regulatory. They're not built into a licensing system. They're not mandated. And so it's a bit of a partnership between the departments of health in a given state and their healthcare system. To the extent that the state has a public healthcare system, as in Washington, elements of the Washington plan were required to be followed by their public health care facilities, but they were just informative. They're just guidance for the private system. And so enforcement becomes a difficult question. When do you jump in to say that they're not following the guidance? When do you jump in to ask a system like OCR or a court to halt the use of those policies if they are resulting in discriminatory treatment? And oftentimes you can't do that until after the fact, until you've seen the hospitals implement it. And we just don't know the extent to which any given hospital or healthcare system in Minnesota is formally adopting the policy that MDH has been developing, or is adopting part of it and then using their own. There are certainly templates that exist for hospitals to use and sign off on to simply adopt. And I think the hope is that most of them will do that, because in a rationing environment, you want the entire healthcare system to be working as seamlessly as possible and to be sort of pulling in the same direction so that you can head off the need to ration. If we've got more ventilators in the Twin Cities than we need, and there's a need for them in Duluth, there should be a way to get them from the Twin Cities to Duluth. Same with currently with remdesivir. We have a limited supply of that, and Minnesota just came out with a specific guidance for rationing the use of remdesivir. To back up to the more general concerns that we've talked about, and give you a little bit more detail about what we've done in Minnesota, and then if people have questions, you can follow up with us in that part of the program. But we did reach out to the Department of Health, and they did respond. They have come out with new guidance just in the last few weeks. They just put it up on their website this week. That has now specifically added to the list of criteria that you cannot ration based on disability, which is helpful, although it begs the question, if you can't ration based on disability, then why can you send people from a hospital to a nursing facility and not otherwise support them in the community? So there's a question of how that's being implemented. And I would say that in all of the documentation I've seen, while they address that kind of flow, patient flow in the planning stages, they don't really think of it or talk about it as rationing, even though it clearly can be. They have done some other things. One of the factors that we'll get into hopefully in the question and answer is the extent to which you consider the person's underlying condition when deciding whether they get access to current care and treatment. And Minnesota has adopted a new, more restrictive standard that we advocated, which basically says if the person is imminently or irreversibly dying from an underlying condition, they have cancer, they have some other condition, or some other condition, chronic health condition or disability, then that would be a basis for denying access to care. Or if the person is terminally ill and has a prognosis of less than 6 months, they'd be eligible for hospice. In the non-rationing context, those factors would influence medical decisions and advice that you would get from the doctor. So in the rationing context, we think it's probably appropriate to carve out that small group as saying, okay, given that we don't have enough to go around, if you fall into those very narrow categories, you might be denied care or offered palliative care or some other alternative. But absent that, longer-term prognosis, the new language in Minnesota's new guidelines pretty clearly says no. Don't look a year down the road, 2 years down the road. At that point, you really are engaging in a guessing game that has a disparate impact on people with disabilities and older people. And that's not consistent with principles of fairness and equity that underlie our ethical frameworks. So I've just got the sign that I think this part of the program is done. I think Lisa's now going to open it up to questions.
Yes, I will. We do have a lot of good questions coming in, but I'm going to begin with one of my own. We've been talking a lot about the impact on people who are receiving their care in congregate facilities, in nursing homes, or in other kinds of facilities like that. And it's important. I think I'd like to ask a question about how these guidances make their way, the legal guidance, that you cannot discriminate, and then the ethical guidance that you should not discriminate. How do they make their way to the people on the ground upon whom so many people with disabilities depend, the personal care attendants, the private doctor who is the doctor that a person who is not hospitalized is going to be seeing in a private clinic? If those how do those messages make their way down to that level? And are those people potentially a group, some of them, who are being disparately impacted by the lack of protective mechanisms for their health when they are dealing with people with disabilities? Your story, Charlie, about the nurses being sent without any protective equipment to recover and to do care in the nursing homes that were not being given any protective equipment was very frightening. So do you have any thoughts or any experiences? What are you seeing on the ground with respect to the people who are not in these institutional settings in terms of understanding that they might not be, they should be thinking beyond just the utilitarian baseline that guides many of the decisions of the medical community?
Charlie, you want to take the first?
Well, I've not studied the question of how these kinds of this kind of information is distributed to these homes. I will say that even if it is distributed, that there's a question of whether those who are in charge of the homes actually care, what their motivations are for following any kind of guidelines or warnings or anything like that. Because I got a number of emails. The reason why I mentioned that at all is because I got a number of emails from workers in nursing homes after my appearance on Fox and after my op-ed in the New York Times last weekend, and these emails are something else. I mean, I got one from a worker who said, "Listen, I've told my management that we need to be testing, that we need better equipment, that I think I'm infected and I think I might be affecting others, and I need to not be working." And at least this email said my management simply didn't care. They didn't react at all, and so this person ended up quitting her job as a nurse, I think a nursing assistant actually, in this particular nursing home. So I'm sorry, I don't have, maybe Bud or others know more than I do about how it's disseminated, but I think there's a question that even if it's disseminated, and frankly, if there's a cost issue or a resource issue related to whether or not a management team is going to react in the proper way, that maybe they won't react in the proper way.
Yeah, I think, Lisa, you've raised a good question. At the primary, first, lowest level, the rationing process can start, but most of the crisis standards of care protocols focus initially on the duty of care, right? They want the primary care physician, the healthcare provider, the individual who's working with you, to try to get you access to the care that they decide that you need to deal with your current medical condition. And they don't want them thinking systemically until they have to. So at the doctor's office, you would hope that if there's medication available, that you would get that medication. If there's a recommendation that you need to go to the hospital because your respiratory condition is so bad, we think you need to get access to a ventilator, we would hope that the doctor, just in the normal course of advocating for the patient, would send you to the hospital with that, essentially that recommendation, that prescription. It's when you get to the healthcare system, to the facility, that most of these guidelines kick in, because they really are aimed at the facilities, not the individual practitioners, but the facilities. And they expect hospital administrations and systems to have already wrestled with this, to already have guidelines in place. And because it's a multi-step and multi-tiered process. You need to be thinking about getting the PPE ahead of time. It's too late. Once you've got the crisis in your doors, it's too late to think, is there anything in the closet, right? Do we have any ventilators? That's too late. So it's the type of conversation that hospitals and facilities are supposed to be having on an ongoing basis. And then operationally, there really is an effort in Minnesota and in most of the better standards that I've seen to separate out functions, separate out that primary care function. Once you get into the hospital, the care team who is going to be interacting with you, that's not necessarily the team that's going to make the decision about rationing. There is usually, built into our guidelines, are recommendations that you have triage teams and secondary review teams who are distinct from your primary care providers. And they will get information about your condition and the recommendation for your treatment, and it will be completely separate from other irrelevant, for lack of a better word, other irrelevant information. They won't know your gender. They won't know your race. They won't know how you're paying for this. They won't know if you have an underlying disability or chronic health condition. They're going to be provided very limited information to determine if this is a scarce resource environment, whether this person, based on their current need, is likely to benefit from this resource, from the use of ventilation or the antiviral medication, is likely to survive to discharge. And if necessary, they can be told whether the person has a terminal illness or not. But if not, they won't look at prognosis because they won't know that you have some other condition that maybe would limit your life expectancy. So if the facility has done that, you hope that that level of process, that secondary review, will insulate the decision-making from improper considerations, from looking at improper criteria, and deal with what sometimes is explicit bias, but certainly deal with implicit bias that can creep into our decision-making. So that still doesn't really answer your question, how do we know that any hospital or system has this information? But the Hospital Association has been involved in developing these guidelines. They've had people on these work groups, and so they know the documents exist. You just have to hope that they have them and that they're using and training people on them.
I have one question here that is just an attempt to sort of broaden the conversation. It's more of an informational question, but there's been a lot of discussion about rationing ventilators, medications, and potential vaccines. And this listener appreciates the comments and the way of framing discharges to nursing homes as a form of rationing, but wonders if you could comment on the other kinds of rationing that we should be monitoring. What are you seeing? What have we been seeing in terms of rationing of other forms of medical care?
Charlie, you want to go first again? I like it when you go first, and then I can fill in whatever
Okay.
gaps exist. Hopefully none.
Okay, well, just recently there was a expose, or not an expose, a very long form kind of diary put out there by a doctor who had come to work in New York. I'm not sure from where, but he described a situation where they had an ECMO machine, you know, the machine that circulates the blood when the heart's not working and oxygenates the blood in a patient, and they needed it for 3 different people, and he had to decide which of the 3 people got it. Now, he didn't describe how he made that decision. He said he made a phone call and the decision was made. But that's enough. We haven't heard much about ECMO machines in part because they're used in not as many circumstances and there are less of them. So that would be one. I do know that the next issue on the horizon, at least as far as I can tell, is how we're going to ration limited doses of therapeutic drugs like remdesivir and also any vaccines that we might create if we don't have, as is likely the case, enough for everyone or everyone that needs it. We're going to have to decide how, in fact, they are distributed. I think Bud mentioned that Minnesota does, in fact, have at least a preliminary plan for remdesivir, but we haven't done much talking about that. I know there are some people saying we got to make sure they get to communities, especially vulnerable communities who don't often get first priority, and I agree with that, but that seems to be the next major set of debates coming down the pike.
Yeah, we focused on some of these topics naturally come up because we're talking about pandemic preparedness and treatment in the COVID-19 world. And so the things that we are most focused on are medication-based treatments, vaccines, and respiratory assistance, because it's a respiratory illness primarily. So it's not just mechanical ventilation. It can be any kind of respiratory assistance, ECMOs, the BiPAPs or CPAPs, depending on what ends up getting used. Part of the difficulty we have and why we can't come up with a specific list is that there isn't one treatment modality right now for COVID-19. You know, it's a coronavirus. It's new. And so even something like remdesivir is experimental. We think that it might mitigate the symptoms. It's not a cure-all, but we think it might reduce your need for ventilation, reduce the time period that it takes to recover from the symptoms. And we don't have enough supply, so it's an obvious topic of rationing right now. But there are virtually any kind of equipment you could use for any kind of crisis could be a topic of rationing, right? You know, it depends on the crisis you're facing. If it's a tornado or an earthquake or some other kind of natural disaster, that can create rationing and that can lead to other kinds of scarcity. Mm-hmm. I think that the one that you've identified, where people go as they're treated with COVID-19 and as they recover, that's a topic of rationing, Charlie, that you've hit on that I don't think is being discussed enough. And it does have a ripple effect throughout because it really does follow you through the different care systems, and you don't want people getting unnecessarily stuck in the wrong part of the care system. But if we really want people to be able to leave the hospital and finish treatment in a community setting, then things need to follow them. Medication would need to follow them. Certainly PPE for other people who are trying to support and care for you needs to follow you. And that's not really happening right now. Mm-hmm. It's certainly not happening in every state and across all service systems. Minnesota has really just started to implement a system for smaller congregate settings like group homes, where many people with disabilities live, to get access to PPE. You know, up until about a week or two ago, there was no system for them to get access to it. So if the group home provider themselves could get access to it, great, you know, good luck. But there wasn't really a statewide approach. And now health has started to organize that because we've been able to, you know, collect more. But we were behind the curve. Everybody was in getting enough PPE. So that's just another way that rationing becomes, that's another way of connecting sort of lack of equipment and lack of space to the rationing discussion.
Mm-hmm. I have another question that somebody has posed. How do the rationing guidelines that have been proposed in all these areas compare with the criteria for rationing scarce organs for transplant? What part of the latter could inform the former?
I think there are problems in the organ transplant world. There are a number of different problems. And honestly, the same kinds of discussions we're having right now have forever been discussed in the organ transplant scenario. There, in fact, was some proposed legislation in Minnesota this year to apply a non-discrimination overlay to transplant policies and practices. But the reality is that people with disabilities oftentimes do not get access to, they're deprioritized, or they're not even allowed onto the list for organ transplants for various subjective reasons. We don't think you can follow the protocol. You know, given the fact that you have a cognitive disability, we don't think you can be compliant with the post-transplant protocols, so we don't think you're eligible. That's a problem because it doesn't consider reasonable accommodations. It doesn't consider informal support networks that the person might have to help them follow the protocol. Frankly, to help that person follow it better than maybe if I don't have any informal supports to follow it. So there's a whole host of, it's a good comparison, and there's a similar set of problems. And for individuals, that's a crisis. It doesn't get the kind of national attention the way this does because everybody's not thinking this could happen to me right now, whereas we are with COVID-19.
I just briefly add, there was a story a year or so ago about CHOP, the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, denying a young patient there a transplant because, to use the phrase that we just used with Alabama, it's tough to hear, but it was used because she was going to be she was mentally retarded. That was the phrase they used. So, and the only reason that this was changed is because the mother got on, I think it was some kind of social media or message board supporting people in her family situation, and there was a lot of public pressure put on, and the hospital, because of that public pressure, changed its mind, as it were. But that case all by itself gives you a reason to agree strongly with Bud here, I think.
So I have a couple of people who are asking the same kind of question. What is your reaction to, what's the connection between what's going on that you're describing and the laws that are being discussed or implemented apparently in some states that would immunize nursing homes for liability for COVID patients that they take?
We don't support those laws. They have been passed in a number of states, and there was a bill proposed that did not get passed before the end of the regular session now. We don't know where it'll go, if it'll get raised again in a special session, but that's exactly what it did. It really protected people from any claim from administrative, civil, or criminal liability for any action that would have been a failure to provide or constitute negligence. Didn't cover them for intentional conduct. So some of the rationing discussion that we've had about discriminatory policies, if you could show that they're discriminatory on their face, they might arguably not get immunity under certain of those laws. You can understand the impetus for them because they feel like they are taking staff from one part of the facility who aren't really well trained, but are necessary because they just need the bodies to provide care, and they're moving them to other parts of the facility. They're dealing in scarce resource situations. They don't have the PPE available. And they're worried about mistakes being made across the board, with their employees, with their clients, with their patients. So you understand the impetus for it. But the problem is one of really accountability. I mean, there's going to, when you immunize them from a claim, it's because somebody has been harmed. And I would prefer that we work at the front end to try to minimize those mistakes and to get better access to the kind of cares and supports and equipment that people need. But it's a problem that most of that legislation is so broad that you really do lose any sense of standards and any consistency or of expectations about what kind of care will be provided. And that just has ripple effects throughout our system. Our licensing systems you can't throw all of that out the window. Otherwise, you really don't have a level of confidence in the care that's being provided.
Mm-hmm. I have a question for Charlie. if it's posted, Charlie, but Bud's response would be interesting too. If nursing homes COVID-19 protocol and care is at fault for the elderly deaths, what's the solution? Should elderly patients in the hospital with COVID-19 stay in the hospital instead of being sent to the nursing home? This participant says Florida has not seen the high number of deaths as New York in nursing homes. Is there something that we could do better that it's happening in a state like Florida?
Well, others might know more than I do about Florida, but my sense is Florida just kept, because they didn't act as if they were going to be overrun, their hospitals would be overrun, they just kept patients in clinical contexts and didn't send them to nursing homes. And when I was talking with my friend about this, who's a physician, she said, listen, we're not a place, we don't have resources to take care of patients that that nursing homes and other long-term care facilities have. And I said, well, but come on, we're in a pandemic situation. We're all doing things that under normal circumstances we wouldn't do. Certainly there has to be a better solution than just lighting a fire of infection and death in nursing homes, right? By sending people back to nursing homes. So again, you can understand why hospitals would say, we're not a long-term care facility, we don't know what to do. But if that's the only other option, and maybe Bud or others have a third option, that is infinitely better to be in a less than ideal situation, taking care of somebody who you're not used to taking care of, than again, 90% of COVID deaths in Connecticut were people from nursing homes with long-term care facilities, 9 in 10. We have to find, and Florida has shown that you can, we have to find a different solution than what we're currently doing in many cases. And I guess from the article I read in the Star Tribune, Minnesota is still right now sending COVID positive patients to nursing homes.
Bud, did you have anything you want to say, or should I start another question?
We can go to another question.
Okay, this one will get you guys thinking. Do factors allocating scarce resources away from the vulnerable, such as the elderly, differ from factors allocating scarce resources away from the strong, that is the young? If you don't embrace utilitarianism, how can you distinguish between those situations?
You're the philosopher, Charlie.
Could you read that one again? I'm looking at the question and answer, and
it's near the bottom of mine.
Near the bottom. What time was
11:46.
11:46.
And that's to say, it's related to the next one too. In caring for the poor and vulnerable, what are your views on prioritizing the elderly or other at-risk groups for distribution once we've developed a vaccine, assuming the initial supply of the vaccine is scarce? So I guess both of these are sort of posing the question of, okay, we've got a vaccine now, but we don't have enough of it for everybody. How do we balance wanting do we prioritize the elderly, and if by doing that, are we doing rationing away from the strong or the young?
It gets into complicated questions in ethics that we think about quite a bit about intention. What is the intention? Or in Catholic moral theology, we talk about the object of the act, which is related to its intention. And I know that these kinds of questions get deep into those kinds of issues. From a utilitarian standpoint, it might seem as if, well, it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other. If you're allocating for older people, are you necessarily allocating against the younger or the strong? From a certain perspective, that might be correct, but it wouldn't be from the perspective of Catholic moral theology, which takes into account the object of the act and which is strongly related to the intention of the act. You can foresee, but not intend, that a consequence of allocating with disproportionate care for the weak and vulnerable would mean that the young and the strong don't get as much consideration as they otherwise would. But that wouldn't be in one's attention in any sense of the matter. The principle of double effect allows for that pretty explicitly. And then it would just be whether you had a proportionally serious reason to do it, at least according to Catholic moral theology. And from a gospel-centered perspective, from a Jesus-centered perspective, we're told to see Christ's face and least among us and give them special priority. And that seems to be what we're called to do in this situation as well.
I don't actually, well, the state of Minnesota's guidance doesn't come at it quite from that perspective, obviously, but I actually think that some of the tweaking of the guidance that Minnesota has done now this year moves more toward the support for access to such interventions, to medications or other scarce resources for people who are more vulnerable. And they've done that by moving a little bit away from a strict utilitarianism point of view. So they used to have language that talked about the overarching goal in a pandemic is to save the most lives, right? And that makes intuitive sense to people, but they have now softened that. And now it explicitly says in bold-faced type in the most recent guidance that the goal is to save the most lives, but also respect rights and promote fairness, right? So there's a balancing of access, which we've been talking about. As you drop down through the guidance, they actually talk from a managing the pandemic standpoint of identifying the people who will most benefit from it and frankly help fight against things like community spread. And if you take the most vulnerable and you help resolve the problem there in that community with that group of people, almost intentionally addressing some of those inequities in our healthcare system, our access to healthcare systems, you will do a better job long-term of fighting the virus, of defeating, the virus by limiting community spread. So under those kinds of principles, the longer-term view of saving the most lives might be benefited by finding those people who are most vulnerable and can benefit the most, and maybe don't have the ability to fight off the virus the way other younger, healthier people do. That's a reversal of the way a lot of these policies have traditionally looked at the role of a healthcare system. I'm suggesting in Minnesota that our guidance actually suggests to hospitals that they take that under consideration. So that's helpful. It's a more nuanced and balanced approach to allocating, a scarce resource.
It is, and it raises another issue that's been raised in a lot of the questions that we won't have time to get into. But you've taken a stab at thinking about this. But it's not just obviously the people with disabilities and the elderly who are being put into vulnerable positions by living in congregate facilities. The predominantly young men of color from poor communities who are in our prisons have been packed together, making social distancing impossible. And so that was one of the comments that we've had from a couple of our participants as well. But there are so many good questions here. I think I've been trying to skip questions that I think that the respondents are answering after you've posed them, and I can't possibly get to all of them. But I did want to just maybe end with one last a question that was presented to us, which is, do you have any recommendations for ways that attorneys or anybody who's watching this program is not an attorney, because we have a lot of people who are not, how can they be involved right now in assisting these vulnerable populations in this particular area, in pro bono work or otherwise? What are the suggestions you have for those of us who might be moved to do something about what we're hearing about to do?
I can think of a couple of things. For people generally, I think it's helpful to have discussions virtually with everybody about this topic. The more people are informed, the more they understand the types of decision making they might experience, their cousin is experiencing because the cousin is in the hospital right now with COVID-19, the more they appreciate what questions they can ask and what their underlying rights might be, the better. And it's difficult to get to everybody in a timely way. And so you all now you can take this information and spread the good word, right? Just to keep people better informed and aware that this is a potential problem down the road. You can talk to your healthcare providers. If you are in the doctor's office, you can ask these questions. If you happen to be in the hospital, even if it's not COVID-19 related, you can ask these questions. Raising awareness, you hope it has a domino effect, and that you're asking the question causes somebody else to ask the question, and maybe there are some answers that get promulgated as a result. In terms of actual client representation, fortunately, we have not had a lot of clients call about rationing issues, but we do have them calling about ongoing care and rights issues. They can't get access to, just basic staffing, or they're in the hospital and the visitation policy is creating problems for them. We're getting those types of calls. you know, I would suggest that you call our intake number and volunteer, because we'll put you to work. If people really have the time, well, we have cases that we can always refer to people. Pro bono is a good thing.
Charlie, do you have any ideas?
Yeah, well, I just mentioned that anybody, I think, but you can correct me on this, anybody can make a complaint to the Office of Civil Rights at HHS on behalf of even somebody else. It doesn't need to be you. It's better if it comes, I think, from a big, large organization, but any individual can do that. I would also echo what Bud said about talking to as many people, be loud, be annoying. I am both on social media when it comes to standing up on these questions. And as a result, there have been, I mean, that's one reason why a few media organizations have come to me, is because I've been outspoken on this. I'd also say, you know, there are a need for especially when it comes to nursing homes, which we've been talking about quite a bit, or group homes. There are a need for to highlight the ones that are doing this right, because I don't want to leave a bad taste in everyone's mouth about this. There are, and in fact, I got a few emails from people saying, "Hey, we're doing this right. Don't lump us in with all the others." And those places need to be supported, and they need to be highlighted. Often they're really expensive to the point where they're really for people with resources and those that not. And I'd just finish with this. Maybe we need some serious reform in how these homes are funded, and how our elders and disabled persons are funded more generally. And that would be a good time to contact your state and federal legislators.
Lisa, let me make 2 more points. I know we're out of time.
Please, Bud.
Just to follow up on a couple of the things that Charlie just suggested. There are a number, we talked a little bit about the administrative complaint process with the Office of Civil Rights at the federal level, Health and Human Services. The Minnesota Department of Human Rights takes administrative complaints and will investigate complaints of discrimination on any basis, you know, racial, gender, national origin, disability, age. And then the Office of Health Facilities Complaints, if you have a particular problem with the way a hospital is doing something, or the way your healthcare provider is doing something, if they're denying you care, you can file, it's like a licensed investigative body, you can file a complaint with them. But I also mentioned that secondary review. If you find yourself in this situation, if a family member is in this situation, you should know that the hospital is supposed to have a secondary review team, and you can ask for, even if you're not told about it, you can ask for that secondary review if you're being denied care. Or if you're being shuttled off to the nursing facility and you don't think that's where you should be going, you can ask for that secondary review.
Thank you. Thank you both. I want to thank both of you from the bottom of my heart for this wonderful presentation. I'd like to also quickly thank Michelle Rash, our program manager, for organizing this, and Xander Moser, our tech genius, and also our sign language interpreter, Sarah Giordiana. And I'm just going to end along the lines of the last question with a reminder from a prayer from St. Thomas More, who is the patron saint of lawyers and of our law school. Give us, good Lord, the grace to work for the things we pray for. Amen. Thank you all. All the materials that have been referenced will be sent to you by email and will also be available on our website for those watching on video. Thank you.